Okay, so welcome. This panel is titled Diversity, Sustainability, and Resilient Educative Approaches, or Diverse Sustainability and Resilient Educative Approaches. And we have 5 panelists here, and they'll give 5-minute talks, and they're welcome to share their screen, and then we'll leave time for ample questions and discussion after these 5-minute so-called lightning talks. And so we'll go in alphabetical order by last name. So first up is Daniel Klooster. Please take it away.
Okay, so I want to tell you about a market transformation of an environment. Markets transform environments. They are our most important institution that broker this relationship. There is a policy instrument called a geographic denomination of origin, which attempts to influence markets. My presentation will be about the denomination of origin for mezcal. My method is to compare and contrast the DOM, because that's so many fewer syllables than denomination of origin for mezcal, with ideal denominations of origin. A lot of that was a lit review of various types of professional and advocacy literatures, and a lot of interviews with mezcal producers and mezcal advocates in Oaxaca, Mexico. Denominations of origin are widespread policy instruments which attempt to recognize products that are linked to a terroir, a gestalt of human and physical geographies, including soils, physical systems, biodiversity, especially agricultural biodiversity, and culture, by which I mean the traditional production processes that create distinct things that can be wiped away by globalized markets. A denomination of origin ought to promote economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, sociocultural sustainability as well. It is trying to protect local production traditions and the associated physical environments and biodiversity from a homogenizing global market. The object of this denomination of origin, mezcal, is incredibly diverse. Mezcal is a spirit derived from the distillations of agave. Agave is a widespread genus with multiple species with varying characteristics in different regions and different humans who manage those agaves in different ways. Incredibly diverse. That diversity varies greatly in space. Agaves are harvested, roasted, mashed, in different ways by different technologies that vary from microregion to microregion. And they are fermented employing, or yes, employing, I suppose is fine, yeasts and bacteria that also vary from microregion to microregion. The mash, with its low alcohol content, is then distilled in copper alembics, which separate out the alcohol and concentrate it, and also in many regions by a variety of different types of distillation technologies, including in some places clay pots, which produce incredible mezcal. This is probably a Philippine technology introduced in the 16th century. The mezcal is dripping out to the left into that little plastic container there. So the resulting liquid is a high alcohol content agave distillate with incredible organoleptic qualities, which vary greatly from producer to producer, agave to agave, and the smokiness is the least interesting part of it. So that's the diversity of mezcal. The denomination of origin of mezcal hides most of that diversity. It's a denomination of origin which is the largest in the world. It is the size of Spain, which by contrast has 90 different denominations of origin for wine and then several more for spirits. The DOM has been quite successful, however, in growing the mezcal market. Much of that growth, however, has come under the control and benefit of big liquor. Companies like Diageo or Campari or Constellation brands, which buy brands that themselves have rather often exploitative relationships with the mezcal producers that are part of that branding commodity chain. Mezcal also produces environmental waste products throughout its production process, and it is also the cause of deforestation and loss of agrodiversity due to an expanding agave monoculture. But the DOM really lacks effective environmental rules about things like that. So let me summarize. In terms of the goals of an ideal denomination of origin, first, economic sustainability could be greatly improved. The DOM has fostered incredible market growth, but it could better support equity for traditional mezcal producers. Second, the DOM rules do little to promote environmental sustainability. It's a region that's too big to recognize the value and biodiversity of mezcal. Terroirs are lost in space. There aren't really great environmental rules. And in terms of sociocultural sustainability, number three, it doesn't really protect local traditions like a denomination of origin ought to. Traditional producers remain marginal, diverse production processes are homogenized, international liquor conglomerates dominate. The broader conclusions are perhaps less interesting because this is a case study of a single denomination of origin, but it generally affirms the importance of denomination of origins as policy instruments with sustainable development potential. But they can be captured by global market actors. And it generally supports the idea that denominations of origin should really put a lot of emphasis on producer organizations that are inclusive and participatory and allow small-scale producers to engage in rural settings, as some of the best denominations of origin in Europe are able to do. Thanks to all of you for listening to this lightning presentation, and to the many very patient mezcal producers who listened to me and answered my questions during a University of Redlands sabbatical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And so next we have Nancy Manring.
Okay. Let me find it here. Okay, wait a second. Okay, can you see my opener there? Okay, so I'm going to be talking about rebuilding a bipartisan environmental movement, and I'm happy to be here and interacting with you all. Thank you for being here. So my motivation for this talk comes from several sources. So on the one hand, like all of you, I know I am tremendously worried about the growing urgency of our environmental problems, as well as our political problems at home. And so I've given other conference presentations for several years now. I have been fretting about the elevation of justice versus the focus on nature in the environmental movement. And it's taken me a little while to talk about it, because it's almost like, oh my gosh, I don't want to question the importance of justice, because obviously that's really central. But the environmental movement was always an environmental movement. And I worry that it is, at least the public face, what we hear about a lot, it's a social justice movement. Now, that would be fine, except that if you look at public polling about environmentalism, you know, by the late 1989, 1990, 78% of Americans called themselves environmentalists. And by 2021, almost half as many, 41%. A couple years ago, Paul Krugman published an editorial in the New York Times, where he wrote about, you know, environmentalism is now seen as this radical woke movement. We see some of this in the context of red state opposition to DEI initiatives. So I've been fretting about that. And the source for this is I've been working on a book. So this is based on my own research. So, you know, when we think about the environmental movement, I think most of us that know something about the movement, you know, sort of perhaps wistful for what seems to be this long gone era of bipartisanship. But based on the research that I've been doing recently, I would argue that there's tremendous potential for rebuilding a bipartisan environmental movement. And I think the potential rests with, in large part, how we frame the movement and how we start talking about it again. So if we think about the environmental movement, obviously we want to balance, caring for people and caring for planet. I mean, in the early years, the movement was all about the planet, right? And then suddenly environmental justice came along and there was a big outcry and a concern that we weren't paying attention to the needs of disadvantaged people. And so if we watch the sort of evolution of environmental and climate discourse, I mean, it's a story of poisoned people and disadvantaged communities, which of course is terrible. I mean, this is the awkward part about giving this presentation, because I in no way want to suggest that we shouldn't be caring for people, that we shouldn't stop poisoning people, and that, we need to do a better job. But there's another piece to this. When we looking just through the lens of the environmental justice movement, the slogan for the environmental justice movement is where we live, work, pray, and play. So I've been grappling with this for several years, and what finally hit me was that what's the missing piece is Black representation in nature. So if we're going to talk about environmental justice comprehensively, if we're going to talk about caring for people and planet comprehensively, we also have to factor in not just poisoned people of color, but people of color who actually love and depend on nature. So, if you start digging into this, there's a whole world. And part of what motivated me was, I'm sure most of you remember, several years ago, Chris Cooper, who was the Central Park birder that was accosted. He, tried to ask a woman to put her dog on a leash, and she whipped out her phone and started claiming that this Black man was molesting her. And it turned into this huge viral thing. And obviously it was a terribly racist incident. But the thing that struck me was, like, I never heard a single comment about, well, of course a Black man might be a birder. And that is, I mean, I've been thinking about this for several years, but the more I've looked into it, I mean, the world is full of people of color who are intimately connected with nature, studying nature, and love nature. So, we've got Dr. Wayman Grant, who's a Black conservation biologist who studies large carnivores. We've got Rodney Stotts, who's one of the few Black master falconers in the country. There's a bunch of organizations, Outdoor Afro, Black Outside, Hunters in Color, that are, helping people of color get outside and enjoy the outdoors. There's Black surfers. And I'm just, and I've shared this with my classes too. I'm so struck by the fact that we just never see images like this. So kind of putting all that together, because, back to like the fundamental purpose of the environmental movement, clearly it cannot be just about the planet. Although obviously if we don't have a habitable planet, there's no point of pursuing justice or anything else. But it simply isn't, appropriate or tenable to say, well, we're not going to think about environmental justice. So I'm arguing that if we think about environmental justice more comprehensively, the very first principle of climate justice, which is just an adaptation from the very first principle of environmental justice that was put forth in the early 90s at the first National People of Color Leadership Summit, it's affirming the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species. I should have said this before, but I'm just going to insert as a side note. I mean, I've been in classes and I've also been in conferences where people are essentially arguing, well, but we have to pursue justice. And my response is, as horrible as it is, justice has been here forever. And if we wait to eliminate injustice, we'll have lost the planet. So basically, I think if we focus again on nature, we have the opportunity to build a very diverse, bipartisan environmental movement, because there's huge numbers of conservatives that are tremendously concerned about clean air and water and public lands and wildlife and outdoor recreation. And what it ultimately comes down to is, I think we need to refocus our attention on nature and build on Americans' shared love of our natural heritage. And that's, I'm sure, my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
How to stop share. Where did we go? Stop share. There we go.
Okay, so next we have Chad Mcguire.
Okay. Here. Screen. Let's see if this works. Okay, great. So resume. Thank you, everybody. My name is Chad Mcguire, and I'm going to move this over here and talk to you about my presentation, which is entitled In Search of Sustainable Coastal Policies, the Legal Concept of Fault Attribution Applied to Federal Disaster Assistance. So the motivation background for this sort of area of research is the US government is what, quote unquote, an insurance company with an army. And this was Peter Fisher is actually coined this term back in 2002. He was the Undersecretary of the Treasury. It's often quoted by Paul Krugman. And Nancy, you mentioned Paul Krugman. So if you read his op-eds, he's a Nobel economist, Nobel laureate that also does op-eds for the past 20 plus years, I think, with the New York Times. But you know, he talks about this all the time, that the U.S. government, effectively, most of it, if you look at it from a, you know, what the income it brings in and then what it spends its money on, right? It's basically an insurance company and an army. So this motivation that I have is, as an insurer, how has the U.S. government treated national disasters in the past in terms of being sort of like an insurance agency for compensating areas and individuals, and also, and as a result of that, creating sort of a policy pathway, and specifically looking at coastal areas in that regard. But how is it treating them today? So how has it treated them in the past? How is it treating them today in terms of disaster relief? And is it planning on changing its treatment of these areas in the future? And if so, what effect, if any, might that have on coastal planning? In other words, if coastal planners have assumed that should a natural disaster occur, you know, those terrible hurricanes or storms, the things that we don't expect to happen, that the federal government will come in and help, and it will help with resources. If that changes, the amount of resources coming in to help with resources, will that change? Are they thinking about that? If the federal government changes its mind on how to provide resources, how much, that sort of thing. So if there are changes occurring or planned, are they understood by those coastal communities? And if so, are they making changes to adapt? In terms of methods and approach, I review the historical policy related to federal disaster assistance in the United States. Very long history, goes back to the founding of the nation, including the underlying basis for that policy, sort of the conceptual underlying reason. Why do we do this? We all have private insurance, most property owners, for example, right? If you're a homeowner, you have home insurance and insures against a number of losses. So why is it that the federal government's involved? And that's above and beyond public NFIP, National Flood Insurance Protection, for example, public flood insurance specifically. If we're talking about coastal areas, I'm talking about disaster relief. So that's sort of the historical policy, and then review current policy adoptions that vary from past policy, as well as future policy proposals. So it's pretty simple. You look at what we've done in the past. You look at what new proposals are being sort of brought into that, what changes are happening. There's always little tweaks, right, on the margins, little things that are changing in terms of the overarching policy. What do those changes look like? What are they signaling? And then in terms of new proposals, where are those new proposals headed? What do they look like? And then apply an analytical framework of what I call fault attribution. This is from legal jurisprudence, sort of like, you know, when you think of torts or things like that, or negligence, right? You think of, when does somebody become responsible for something that happens to somebody else? Where's that line of responsibility? And does that change? Like a very young person, for example, are they responsible for committing acts against other people? Usually age is a factor. When they're younger, the same act, maybe they have less responsibility. As they get older, we attribute more responsibility onto them because we assume that with age, they gain levels of capacity. So something like that in terms of this notion of fault attribution, if that makes sense. So and then apply an analytical framework of that fault attribution to interpret any observed policy changes. And then based on the evaluation of observed policy dynamics, interpret evolving policy direction in relation to current coastal planning dynamics. In terms of results, I hope this comes up if it's larger on your screen, because I did it by side. Effectively, what I found is the following in terms of previous results. I should go back on that one for a second, sorry. Is in terms of, if we can look at our sort of evolving understanding of climate change and the actual effects, what we're seeing in the policy is that if we put on a spectrum natural hazards, what we call a normal event, what we'd assume is a normal event, or at least the federal government would term as a normal event on one end of the spectrum, and a natural disaster as an abnormal event on the other end of the spectrum, we can say things like, I'm using hurricanes here, historical demarcation of policy before climate change is understood, that category 1 or 2 hurricane. If you're in Florida, for example, historically, category 1 or 2, that would be normal. You would expect it. So there wouldn't be federal government help necessarily for those types of things. There would be private insurance. That would be an expectation where that's a responsibility. What's happening is that as climate change is changing, what I've seen over the policies, this is just to give you a synopsis of it. In 2000, you would say that effectively they're saying higher, stronger categories of hurricanes are now the norm. And that's even more so today, maybe even where a category 3 or category 4 is considered to be norm. It's considered to be something that isn't outside of the norm, which is when normally is triggered federal disaster relief. When it's, the damage and the extent of the harm goes so beyond what you would expect that the federal government steps in to help out because your insurance and your protections and your preparation isn't enough. To look at that from a financial perspective, just to do this really quickly, ever since the federal government has been monitoring its outlays of federal disaster, if we go back to the 60s, fiscal year 1964, dollar for dollar, these dollars are controlled. So these are apples to apples comparison over time. And we look, what you see here is in the yellow bars, you see what the federal government has reserved, has put aside ahead of time for federal disaster assistance, the money it thinks it's going to need to spend on disaster. And the blue is additional amounts that they had to appropriate because the disasters in that particular year were so bad and got so much more than was expected. So what's happening is that the federal government's doing two fascinating things here, if I can say it really quickly. And that is they are changing their policy to be more restrictive while at the same time doling out more and more money to those communities when disasters happen. That's problematic if you look at that from a, because what ends up happening is your expectation's one thing, and then all of a sudden, the expectation from the receivers is one thing, the expectation of the government as the provider is another. So federal disaster expenditures are increasing. For adjusted dollars, all time, about 478 billion, 153 billion appropriated, 325 billion supplemental. We pay a lot more. We hope it's going to be less than it is, and then it's worse, especially in the last 2 decades, as you can tell from that last graph. In the last decade alone, we spent about 290 billion out of that. 122 billion of that was appropriated, 168 supplemental. We're getting better at assuming worse. You could see that the yellow was higher over the last decade or two. We're getting better at appropriating money ahead of time, but we're still exceeding the costs. But the federal policy is moving towards greater local responsibility for disaster exposure, which means that there's a divestment that's happening through fault attribution. What effectively the federal government is saying is that coastal communities should now understand that they're going to get bigger disasters, more significant disasters, and they should be responsible for that. They should plan better for that. So if you keep developing these areas, for example, we're not going to come in and keep rescuing you, that kind of thing. So there's this divergence that's happening. That's it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have two more speakers. Next up is Jessica Rich.
All right. Thank you. Can everyone see my screen all right? Is that coming up? Okay, thanks. All right, thanks everyone for being here with us today. My name is Jessica Rich. I'm research faculty at Virginia Tech and also co-PI with the NSF sponsored Greenland Hazards Project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing research I've been doing on the valuing of expertise in Arctic science research funded by NSF. So just some background, I'm a communication researcher investigating barriers to science community partnerships in Greenland. The Greenland Hazards Project is a 5-year study of land instability due to climate changes on the west coast of Greenland. And we're interdisciplinary, so we integrate geoscience and communication research, computer science, as well as working with communities and listening to local observations about natural hazards on the coast. And this project is part of NSF's Navigating the New Arctic initiative, which was created in 2017 to support research that they say informs national security, economic development, and societal well-being, and enables resilient and sustainable Arctic communities. And the NNA I see is reflecting this convergence turn in research funding that invests in solving complex research problems with a focus on societal needs and also interdisciplinarity. And so from the social science side, I've become really interested in how definitions of expertise are varying among scientists and community members where science research is being done, but also how the valuing of expertise has changed at NSF over time in policies and the kinds of science that's being funded. And so this research question has emerged for me about, what do shifts in NSF policy tell us about that valuing of the expertise in the Arctic? So for the study that I'm talking about today, I did a qualitative meta-analysis using that to study about 1,200 abstracts of NSF-funded Arctic research collected between 1958 and 2023. And I'm using a theoretical assumption that scientific knowledge production is political in its foundation, that it relies on a series of, decision-making processes at the scientist's level, and also this academic, military, industrial network, complex network that's embedded with really dynamic power relations, which can then have varying results depending on how those interests are influencing policy. So I just wanted to share some of my initial findings from this study. So it might be expected between 1962 and 2010, and these very early abstracts, the scientific and technical knowledge dominate the work that's being done in the Arctic. I have some quotes here from the abstracts, but we can see how expertise is really represented through things like geochemistry and geoscience, modeling, glaciology. You might see, later on some environmental historians and ecosystem experts, but it's primarily this scientific and technical expertise that's really represented. And there are also, especially early on, a lot of outdated words and phrases that NSF wouldn't be very proud to repeat, but that has certainly changed. And again, there's just this very heavy reliance on natural sciences, engineering, economics, and policy experts. And then moving into later years, kind of the past decade or so, the definition of expertise has been changing, so that those definitions have become more inclusive of different ways of knowing. There's a recognition of indigenous and local knowledges. I'm finding that there's more inclusive language found in American and Canadian Arctic research, but not necessarily in Greenland. And there has been even more of an increase after 2017 with NSF funding, probably due to Navigating the New Arctic, which was funded to funding work that encouraged these community partnerships in Arctic science research and kind of recognizing these historical wrongs of the past and trying to be more inclusive. And I think some of the conclusions that I'm coming to is, there are, the late 2000s, thinking about the influence of policy coming out of the Obama administration, also thinking about the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and these increases to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in organizations, and NSF responding to that. But as with any research, these findings are prompting more questions, and some of these have to do about that decision making that's being occurring within these projects. So I'm interested as I move on to think about how scientists are making decisions about research, thinking about whether the projects truly are collaborative in these in the research that's being done in the Arctic, or if that language is more performative. Thinking about what changes are needed in the culture of science itself to spur more demand for equitable research practices, and then also thinking about whether scientists actually consider themselves to be advocates for these communities where they're working, and also in that process of co-production. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I have my contact information here, and just a quick acknowledgement of NSF for the support. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And our final presenter on this panel is Joy Liu, and she will be sharing her screen here. Thank you so much.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Yeah, I want to apologize. My camera is not working today. It was yesterday, so, but I will start my presentation. So, I'm Joy Liu. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Arizona, working in the Controlled Environment Agriculture Center, which is basically greenhouses and growing crops or using aquaponics systems and to grow both fish and crops. And there are people growing grapes here as well. So I'm looking at eco-certification, specifically in aquaculture sector, and how it's impacting producers specifically. So my motivation comes from my interest in seafood and the recent increased attention paid by both government agencies such as NOAA and also international organizations such as United Nations FAO, which has been promoting small-scale aquaculture or aquaponics systems for over a decade now. And just earlier this month, the report from FAO stated that aquaculture production of aquatic animals has surpassed capture fisheries for the first time. Directly related to seafood governance, people usually think about environmental sustainability, but consumers are also very concerned about pollution in the ocean, food safety, animal welfare is also become an important issue. And then lastly, it's how the labor is being managed in both fishery and aquaculture sector. Fishery tend to have more controversy in terms of their labor policy, but aquaculture also has their own issues. For me, I think of this topic I can look at this topic from two angles. It's one is political ecology, and the other is food, energy, water nexus. So if students can approach this topic from both of this approach. And so I put this news clip here just to show you that there's a lot of controversy right now regarding how aquaculture is managed. So certification has become a way of governing certain activities in different sectors. If you've probably heard of Forest Stewardship Council, if you buy certain paper products or printing, they might have that logo FSC on the product, and you might see them. And now it's also and also in food sectors, but now it's being used in seafood a lot. And the justification comes from the idea that government policies are ineffective and that nonprofit sectors doesn't have a enforcement power to regulate them. And the biggest two certification standard setting agencies are Best Aquaculture Practice, which is more producer oriented, and Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which is run partially, it's run mostly by nonprofit sectors and such as World Wildlife Fund. That's how they develop their standards, through collaboration with different stakeholders. My methods, primary data comes from open-ended interviews. Especially this summer, I will interview more people, and communications with managers, producers, and certification body staffs if they're willing to talk to me, and of course news articles, papers, reports, and also some local meetings that I can attend or short courses where stakeholders attend. So far, my findings indicate that there is the producers tend to prefer the term responsible seafood because perhaps most of the consumers are not consumers, but there's another term, traceability, which means which is more point to supply chain management, that you can trace a certain product from the source to the consumers. But the people I interviewed, they prefer responsible because it's indicating that the producers themselves are responsible. And so the picture on the right is from BAP, best aquaculture practice. They covered their standards covered from the hatcheries, farms, feed mills, and all the way to processing. So each entity has to go through the certification verification process. And then the picture in the below is it's not aquaculture, it's fishery, but I put it there because they also use the term responsible, as in if you see the logo on the left, bottom left, Certified Sustainable Alaska, RFM means fishery management. Okay, so it usually means there's a third party coming to evaluate your operations, but there's also concern about greenwashing, as you know, and also if it's really a third party, because if the client is directly working with the certification body, then it can become a two-party. It's not really third party in a way, and so these are just currently the 4 pillars of responsible seafood. And so my conclusions so far, locally, like the specific conclusions concern is about certification for who, because there is a lot of concern about overusing eco labels. When you go to grocery stores, everything has a certain label, and consumer doesn't really know what that means. And then the secondly is wholesalers and retailers hold the power to request for certified product, and so they actually hold a lot of power. If they don't require the certification, then nobody will do it, producers. And then the third thing is similar to aquaponics. Most of the aquaculture producers are small scale, and half of them are outside of the US, so it's hard to regulate them, and they don't necessarily have the resource to go through the certification process. And the broader conclusion is that coming from this more specific conclusion, we should try to, because certification process, the standards are developed by people who are not necessarily directly involved in the production process. So there's concern as to what the standards, how to ask a producer to be compliant with it. And then the second the second conclusion related to this is that if you involved more diverse people to involved in the standardization setting process, then how can you make it democratic and more civic oriented? So that's so far my conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. That was great. So this is excellent. So Ellie, you mentioned you had some questions at the beginning, so let's go to you very quick here. Thanks.
Sure. I don't mean to hijack the initial Q&A,
okay.
but I was really pleased. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your talk. It was really just snappy and really interesting. I thought you did a great job of kind of telling us the new things. My question was about, I should have written it down, but sort of about this, scale. So as somebody who's trained in geography, many of us are, we would never say something quite so blithely as like, well, we should have a smaller scale that will solve all your problems. And of course, you didn't really do that when you talked about the ways that this DOM could take into account other kinds of measures. But I wondered if you could kind of, yeah, what relevance does literally having just a smaller scale, like what would that get us part of the way, or is that again just super simplistic and it's much more about trying to have metrics that include a measure of cultural sustainability and things like that?
So I guess the if we want to put this into construction of scale kind of thinking, I wasn't exactly suggesting that we just need to have a smaller denomination of origin, but rather that the denomination of origin for mezcal needs to have mechanisms in it that recognize the diversity within that larger region, that give ability to villages, because I mean, people in San Baltasar Chichihapan, for example, will say, our mezcal is not anything like Matatlan. But there's no way that they can, use the certification processes of the denomination of origin and differentiate their mezcal from the neighbors down the street who are much more integrated into global commodity chains for mezcal. So it's yeah, I guess
Is
I'm
there
doing this. I guess I'm mobilizing scale in a naive way, but the general argument is that there's a lot of variation within that large area which can't really be visualized or valued or recognized because of the way that it has been built.
Is there any precedent for the kind of subscale threads? Like if Spain has, you said, 90, like are there, or well, that's not a great example. Is there a place where you might have the whole state of, I don't know, Catalonia, and then there's a smaller version like you're saying here? I mean, again, that's kind of an empirical question that you might not have an answer to.
Well, empirically, most denominations of origin are much smaller. The European models, the French, Spanish, and Italian models in particular, are ones which not all of them are great, but the ones that do work well have inclusive producer organizations where there might literally be debates between milk producers and cheese makers to get input prices set correctly and try to say, well, our cheeses are not the right kind of cheese if they're not from, diverse meadow grasses. So how do we make that happen? Because that's important to us in this micro region. And those kinds of debates can't really happen with the way that the Mexican policy has been built and put together.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Again, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions from the audience members? I have a ton. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
So I've got a question for Joy. And I guess the question is, what does she think? What do you think, Joy, is the best outcome for eco-certification in aquaculture? Do you think that certifications there are like training regulators, or like trying to keep neoliberalism from pushing all of these producers in a race to the bottom, or driving forces in retailers and wholesalers? I don't know. What do you think is driving this system? What is the political ecology of eco-certification in aquaculture?
That's a good question. If, in forestry, which is like in forestry right now, because it's probably the certification that has a longer and better history, because aquaculture is just starting. In forestry, there's also the product itself has it's so far away from where it's produced that there's a separate certification process. There's forest management, and then there's chain of custody, which is a two separate process and two separate type of certifications. And in aquaculture, in aquaculture right now, there's also a similar issue, is that it's hard to really define a technical unit. And that's where producers are, they don't think it's fair to them that you're producing, how do I say this? You're not, well, I don't really know. I don't really have an answer right now.
Okay.
But I would welcome if you have a particular, direction you can point me to, because it is very controversial. The Alaska example that I mentioned, even though it's not aquaculture specifically, in the beginning, they tried to use Marine Stewardship Council certification, but after about 10 years, they decided they want to have their own certification. So there is this kind of resistance to a international standards, but their own standard is still based on FAO standard. But now the certification process, they have more ownership of the process rather than just delegate or outsource it directly to a Marine Stewardship Council, which is based in United Kingdom. And so is AESS, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, is also based in UK. They've started to develop a program that's specifically trying to help small scale farmers to go through the process, because it's just too expensive for them to even try to consider the certification for small scale producers. So yeah, and then BAP are more oriented to producers, but then they rely more on the certification fee that they collect as to operate their organization, if that makes sense. ASC are they have more donations, I think, in general, from the nonprofit sector. So they're operated slightly differently in terms of their financial situation. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
So I did a lot of work on Forest Stewardship Council certification several years ago. And if it would be useful to you to talk more about these kinds of things as you go on with your research and pose your questions, I'd be very happy to bounce ideas back at you.
All right.
I put my
Okay.
email in the chat.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
It's really interesting stuff. It's like the shiny side of neoliberalism, I guess.
Yes.
So this is great. So I might push it to go like 2 minutes over time because we're almost at 50 after the hour. But I just want to acknowledge like the interesting intersections between these papers that might not be explicit and noticeable reading the abstracts, but in terms of, Chad's work on localities getting money, it overlaps with inclusiveness and justice issues that are apparent in the other two papers by Nancy and Jessica. So I was struck by Nancy's chart that she showed about the decline in self-identified environmentalists. And I believe that started in the late 80s and then until relatively recently. So I was just wondering, what alternative hypotheses could be considered here on the decline of self-identified environmentalists? So you have that, now famous, and even at the time, famous congressional testimony by James Hansen in the late 80s on climate change that spurred a lot of, big time political money being spent demonizing climate change activism. And you also have, the growth in the 90s of this conservation versus economic growth trade-off, right? And a lot of money was spent there attacking environmentalism. And so I wonder, how much, credence do you give alternative hypotheses to the reason why people would not identify as environmentalists?
This is Chad. I don't know if you were asking that directly to Nancy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Nancy, and then, anybody wants to chime in, but yeah, Nancy's Nancy.
Yes, I do have an answer, and it's what my book is focused on. After the public backlash against Reagan's anti-environmental policies, conservatives learned a very important lesson, that they couldn't attack the environment head on. So what they figured out was they needed to challenge the science and they needed to denigrate environmentalists. So if you look at that timeline, it coincides exactly with the beginnings of a very orchestrated campaign, you know, among conservatives in government, think tanks, radio personalities, talk show hosts, you know, to challenge the science and denigrate environmentalists. And, you know, when you look at some of the research that has been done asking people about environmentalists, the list of negative stereotypes is jaw-dropping. So, you know, others have suggested that, like, for example, millennials don't identify with the term very much, that may just be outdated. I think, I haven't seen research like this, but I would guess that the focus on justice is where a lot of younger folks are turning their attention. And I think there's a disconnect between notions of environmental justice and the actual planet. So anyway, there's a variety of things, but yeah, the most tidy explanation is that decline begins just when conservatives literally systematically set out to denigrate the environmental movement and environmental science.
Thank you. And you know, the representation of marginalized communities in nature is very important. So I want to raise that. So there's nonprofits like Latino Outdoors that does a lot of what you're suggesting. And so real fast, Chad, your work was incredible here, and I think the trend towards local responsibility for this for disaster is a disaster. And so with big time insurance companies moving out of state markets, you know, what do you see as the future here of what you found?
So yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, right, if the federal government isn't going to backstop, so the federal government acts as like a reinsurance agency, right? The insurance agent for the insurance companies. It's like where you're not insured, where the insurance company doesn't cover, we're going to step in and we'll do that additional coverage. Zero premium, by the way, it's taxpayer dollars. We don't charge you for it. Again, I'm not talking about national flood insurance. That's different, but it's connected. So if the federal government gets out of the game or even reduces the level of responsibility it has, and it's showing in its policy. So what's fascinating that I couldn't explain in detail is that what you're seeing new policy that's being add-ons to the existing structure, which is, hey, we used to give federal disaster assistance to any community. Superstorm Sandy, remember? Hey, disaster. And recent fires. I deal with coastal disasters, but fires, you name it. The disaster. Absolutely, we're here. FEMA, lots of money, supplemental. If we don't have the money, we'll go ahead and do a supplemental appropriation in Congress, bipartisan, no problem, here's the money. Now they're adding a bunch of provisos, which are, you know, for coastal communities, it's like, well, if you're in a significant flood, if you're in a dangerous area, very low-lying area that floods, like Miami Beach, for example, you have to be rated. You have to go through the process of getting community rating under our National Flood Insurance Program. If you don't do that, then we're not going to do extra coverage. So what you're seeing is the federal stepping out. And then you mentioned really quickly, Paul, the states, right? So it's, if I can't get private insurance in California and Florida and many other areas, right, where the private insurers are pulling out, then the states have this state insurer of last resort. What that ends up becoming, of course, is who's the people that aren't insured, right? What's the risk profile of the person who can't get a good deal on insurance or get insured for their property? It's really high. So it's like a health insurance company, the state, that has a bunch of very sick people and only sick people in there. There is no diversity, right? So that's what you call, what do they call that there? A moral hazard, or, you know, those are one of those situations where your risk profile is, the point is that's just taxpayer money at the state level. And the state wants to ask the federal government to help bail it out. And then you get it, right? So there's a vicious cycle that, yeah, can easily unfold there. Yes.
That's a really good analogy to help. I think that's great. Okay, well, I monopolized enough of the time here, and so we're about 5-6 minutes over, and so I really appreciate the audience questions and the interaction. This was really good, and I look forward to reading everybody's work I was just introduced to. So I really appreciate that, and so thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really good panel.
Yeah, excellent.